Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure Infrastructure Update. It's the 6th of September. Number of updates this week, and I've totally slacked. No new videos this week. I mentioned last week I was moving, so every spare minute has been putting furniture together and moving boxes. I haven't really even done workouts this week, so back to normal next week. So on to what's new though. So on the compute side, for Logic App Standards, there are now out-of-box monitoring dashboards. Think Insights, a curated set of views across a number of different areas. Now, when you go into this, you'll see 4 tabs. So you'll see Overview, Workflows, Runs, and Compute, so showing the utilization. Now, I do have to make sure my Logic apps are connected to App Insights. It's using a log analytics workspace behind the scenes to collect and then perform those evaluations. And I have to be using the V2 schema. But if I have all of that in place, I'm now going to get this nice curated set of dashboards across those different areas for Logic App Standard. Also for Logic App Standards, we now have template support. Now, what this is going to let me do is think of it as some pre-built workflows across a number of different integration scenarios, from pretty basic through to more complex combinations, event-driven type processes. And really think of them as a starting point. They're a very robust, best practice set of starting points onto which I can then customize and add my own things. I'll just open up my Logic App Workflows, click Add, and under Add, you'll now see an Add from Template option. And I go and select that template I want, and they're grouped by different categories, types of connector, so I can easily find that starting point that works for me. Virtual Machine Scale Set Automatic Instance Repair has gone GA. And what I have here is you have a number of VMs that make up that virtual machine scale set. And if it's unhealthy, well, it can go and perform one of a number of different types of actions based on my configuration. Now, the important point is that health is not just based on is the Azure Resource VM healthy or not. That's not that useful to me. It's actually based on what is the health of my workload that runs inside the VM. And that's done either by using the application health extension or the load balancer health probe, i.e., I configure what is the signal it's going to check to ascertain the health of my workload running inside. And then if it determines it's not healthy, I have one of 3 options I can configure: replace, reimage, or restart. Now, if I do replace, as the name suggests, it's deleting the entire instance, the entire VM. So I lose the OS disk, the data disks, the entire state, and it's going to create a new one based off of the latest template image and configuration for the virtual machine scale set. So that's the most severe, but also it's the most likely to fix any problem you have. Then I can do reimage. Reimage doesn't delete the VM instance. It's not going to change the data disk, but it's going to replace the OS disk image with the latest, again, version for that virtual machine scale set. So it will leave the data disks alone, I think temp data alone. It's not replacing the VM, but it's going to replace the OS disk. And then a restart, the Etch-a-Sketch, turn it off and on again. It's just going to restart the thing. So obviously less impactful, but also potentially less likely to solve depending on what the cause of the problem is. So I get to pick, and that's now available. On the networking side, so now for public IPs, obviously standard, zone redundant is the default if the region supports availability zones. So the default will now just use zone redundant. So the IP address is available and resilient across the 3 AZs for my subscription. So even if there's an AZ level failure, my public IP would still be available. Now I can still go in and say, hey, I want it to be zonal. I align to a specific AZ I pick, or I could just say, hey, non-zonal, Azure will go and pick a particular zone to stick it in. But by default now it's going to give me that most resilient option. And Azure Bastion now has Entra-integration for SSH via the portal. Remember, Azure Bastion provides me that managed jump box capability. So it avoids me having to make my virtual machines directly publicly accessible. That helps protect it from, for example, port scanning, and I can then add extra levels of security. So the Entra integration means, hey, I'm using that Entra authentication to go and authenticate to the virtual machine. Now, because it's Entra integration, I require the Entra ID login VM extension to be configured on the target VM. Now, we always think of SSH as Linux, and obviously I can do the Entra ID integration with that, but also if I'm running the standard or premium SKUs of Azure Bastion, I can also use SSH to connect to Windows VMs. So now I can use Entra integration for the SSH connection to my Windows or Linux via Azure Bastion. Now, when I perform that connection, what you're going to see is for the connection settings, I'm going to select SSH, and you just make sure you set the authentication type to Microsoft Entra ID. And again, then I can use the RBAC configurations of the virtual machine about that connectivity. I can get things like conditional access checks and all of that goodness that comes with the Entra integration. On the storage side, so Azure Storage Mover now has bandwidth management in GA. So Azure Storage Mover helps me move data from SMB and NFF shares I have on premises to Azure Storage. What this bandwidth management lets me do is take all the hours of the week. I can go and set for specific hours how much bandwidth I want it to allow. Now, if I don't set a limit, then it can use whatever it wants. But where I set those limits, it's only allowed to use that much bandwidth. So this is really useful. For example, maybe during the working hours, I would say, hey, you're only allowed to use 50 megabits per second because I want to be considerate of my actual primary workloads and business critical workloads. It's not some noisy neighbor sucking up all of my WAN connection. But then in quiet hours or weekends, hey, maybe you can use 500 megabits per second or whatever you want to do, or there's no limit, use as much as you want. So I can actually go in there and configure that on a per hour basis for every hour of the week. And then Azure Container Storage by Azure Arc Edge Volumes is in preview. So where I have my Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters, this could be on-premises, whatever, I can now have this Azure Container Storage powered by Azure Arc Edge Volumes. So it's going to add some components to my Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster and then bring some of that goodness of Azure Container Storage, which is a storage solution tailor-made for Kubernetes. And it's going to expose two different types of volume. There are local volumes. So a local is this shared read, write, many storage. It's three-way replication, highly available, highly resilient, but using the local storage of the Kubernetes cluster. But I can also do cloud edge volumes. Cloud edge volumes, it's still going to initially write to local storage, but that's more of just a temporary cache. So it can then go and copy it into Azure Storage. This could be Blob, ADLS Gen 2, which is hierarchical namespace on storage, or Fabric OneLake. And what it's going to do is every minute, it kind of wakes up, looks at what data needs to be copies it up into the cloud, waits 5 minutes, and then deletes it from that local cache so it has space for you to copy your next set of data. So now I can leverage that in preview. And of course, if I'm using those cloud edge volumes, it's essentially infinite space. But obviously, remember when I come, there's a certain latency will get introduced when I try and access that data again. Miscellaneous. So Azure API management, which remember is phenomenal for that runtime API, gateway capabilities, exposing security, etc., now has expanded generative AI gateway capabilities. And this is 3 new policies, one of which lets me define and enforce large language model token limits. Tokens are obviously huge for large language models. The tokens used for my prompt, i.e. the input, and then what is returned to me, the responses. I also have large language model real-time metrics for the consumption, so I can see what's being used. And it has large language model semantic caching. Remember, semantic is all about the meaning of what we're doing, which is huge for the natural language, large language models, where one word can mean different things and many words can mean the same thing. So with the semantic caching, what it's going to do is based on the semantic context and that vector proximity. Vectors represent the semantic meaning, so how close the vectors are means the meaning is similar. It can then use that cache to return results, which will reduce the actual resource use of your large language model and accelerate those responses. So those are in preview. Azure Site Recovery Certificate Auto Renew has gone GA. Certificates are used for the on-premises agent components to talk to Azure. Well, the certificate is critical. And if it expires, well, then I have big issues. So with the auto renew, you're not going to have any impact. It's just going to automatically renew and continue that communication used for all of your application. And then for Azure OpenAI, there are a number of updates. The first is GPT-4o, 2024-08-06. This adds support for structured outputs, so that's available. GPT-4o Mini now has provisioned deployments. Remember, provisioned is all about that predictable performance in terms of latency, in terms of throughput. You'll hear the phrase PTU, provision throughput units, over and over again. So now I can leverage that as part of my GPT-4o Mini. It will depend on the region. It's going to open up for me where that's available. So as always, you just go and check the model page and go and check provision deployment model availability. So here you're looking at the GPT-4o Mini in this case, and you can go and look at, well, where is that ticked? And that will tell you the regions where I can go and use that provision. So I can go and use that for everything. And then there's just the standard where I'm not using provisioned. This is a great page to always go and check, hey, where can I use the various different things? And then also, GPT-4o fine-tuning is available in preview. Now remember, we generally don't need to fine-tune. We use prompt engineering, we use retrieval augmented generation to add more knowledge. That's always the first thing we try and do. But if we find that's not meeting our requirements, if we need customization beyond that, we need to really fundamentally change how it responds. We need to add industry and domain-specific knowledge and language, etc., then maybe we have to do fine-tuning. Well, now we have that in preview with the GPT-4o. And that was it. As always, I hope that was useful. I'll get new videos out. Apologies for the week of slacking. I've just been putting together so many bits of furniture and moving so many boxes. Until next video, take care.